Good evening and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Green, and we're coming to you from the studio of Medgar Evers College over the air of WNYE 91.5 FM. Writers on Writing comes to you each Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. And I am very, very pleased to have with me on the telephone Dr. Janet Dewart Bell. Welcome, Dr. Bell, Dewart Bell.
Thank
Welcome.
you very much, Dr. Green. It's really a pleasure to be on your program.
Well, I'm very happy that we could connect. I know this has been a dream of yours, and you've just written a very, very important book that chronicles the lives of prominent civil rights activists, women, African-American women in the civil rights movement, lighting the fires of freedom.
Yes.
I love that title.
Yes, a labor of love. It was really wonderful, and I was honored and humbled to be able to talk to these magnificent women.
Okay, so we're going to get into details, but I would like to share with our listening audience that Dr. Janet Dewart Bell is a social justice activist with a doctorate in leadership and change from Antioch University. She founded the Derek Bell Lecture on Race in American Society series at the New York University School of Law, and she is an award-winning television and radio producer and lives in New York City. And we don't like to say this about women, but do you mind if I also give the other connection?
I don't mind at all, because like with Mrs. Evers and Merle Evers and Medgar Evers, Derek Bell and I were absolute partners, and we both celebrated that relationship.
Okay, so and you are the wife of the late Derek Bell.
Yes.
Prominent attorney, professor, activist. So let's talk about
And author.
And author, of course. I had an opportunity to meet him when I ran the former Incuro books, and he came and spoke. Faces at the bottom of the well. I'll never forget. He came and
It's bottom of the well.
That's right. So your book is about 9 women who bare their souls, right?
Yes.
They give their stories as activists, their challenges, and their highlights. And why don't we begin by asking you to share with our listening audience about this project that grew out of your dissertation and how you came to write this book and why you wanted to write this book.
Yes, well, when people ask me how long it took me to write the book, I say either all my life or 2 years. 2 years of active writing. And it grew out of my work in researching African American women as leaders. My doctorate is actually in leadership and change, and so while these women are activists and advocates, they're also leaders, because my theory of leadership is that you can lead from the center or the end of the pack. And servant leadership is part of that concept where people don't necessarily have the titles and don't claim a position, but they lead a cause and lead a movement. And these women who worked in different ways had really influential parts of the civil rights movement. So I was very excited about this topic. I've been a civil rights activist myself all my life. At 12 years old, I was the youth president of the local NAACP in my hometown of Erie, Pennsylvania, and so I've always felt this passion for social justice. And so to go back later in life, to go back to school, I didn't go back to get my doctorate until I was in my 60s, and actually almost 60. I got my doctorate a little bit after Anna Julia Cooper. I was hoping I'd get to her date by, when did she get hers? I think 64 or something, but I missed that. I was a few years later than that.
Oh, that is wonderful. So you wanted to write this project, so tell us about the project, and
Yes.
then how did you decide which women you wanted to focus on?
Well, I started with, I had several questions that I wanted to pursue. And one thing I definitely wanted to do was to have people who were representative of different levels of involvement in the civil rights movement. Some, for me, well known. All of them actually, for me, are well known. But for most people, they were not. I wanted to have some people who were not so well known, or people whose particular level of leadership might not be considered that by someone else. So I started off with that, and I was lucky enough to get a representation of people who I think really reflected that. And then because you go through, you as an academic, of course, as your PhD, you have to go through this process where you do methodology and all this kind of stuff.
Yes.
So I did all that, and then they tell you, okay, how do you summarize this? And so I said, okay, I did my little Venn diagram where I said, okay, all of this stuff, which is an inadequate summary, but it's the best I could do, where what really stood out for me about these women, all of them, is their authenticity, their courage, and their purpose. I mean, they were so, and then below those three categories, there's a lot going on. That is their cultural identity, their fact that they were all grounded in one way or another in black culture. I think that gave them the strength to do the extraordinary kinds of things that they did. And the other thing about them that's amazing is the humility. They don't think necessarily what they did was amazing. And I go, well, yes, it was. In fact, a couple of people almost declined the interview because they said, well, you get somebody else because what I did wasn't extraordinary. And I said, well, I beg to differ with you. And then I sort of laughed with my odd sense of humor. Well, this is my book, so please
Okay.
go along with
All
me.
right. So how many women did you end up starting with?
I had 10 in mind, and then we wound up to the Magnificent Nine. So that worked out just fine.
Okay.
You know, partly it's timing, people availability, and people who will devote the time to do this. Part of the reason much of our history and whatever I think is lost, unfortunately, is because we don't have the time to, we're so busy doing the work, we don't have time to talk about the work.
That's right. Well, I thought that maybe you had a dissertation that had more writers, but you used all of the women. You used all of the women you interviewed for this book.
Yes, that is correct. But I also, in my dissertation, that great literature review, I had a lot more women that I mentioned in my dissertation.
Right.
To do in my public presentations. But the book, you have to confine it to a number of pages, and that's how this.
Right. Well, you do a nice job of providing in your introduction, providing the context. And I really found fascinating your description of the three types or three modes of leadership: transformational leadership, servant leadership, and adaptive leadership. Can you share with the audience what that means, and maybe one or two examples for each of the writers you chose of what kind of leadership best conveys what they've done?
Well, all of them, we didn't, at that point, we weren't going to schools to get degrees in leadership and change. We just did it.
That's right.
And
you did the work.
We did the work. And as my mother would say, we did not stand on ceremony. And so you looked at a situation, and it may be that someone is coming up with a particular style of leadership. Usually it's the top-down leadership, right? You have the person at the top, and then you have a hierarchy. These women all chose a way of adapting whatever that was to the situation so that it would be more movement-oriented, so that it would get more people involved. So that's the adaptive part of the leadership. And as servant leaders, they were not concerned about their own titles and self-aggrandizement. They were concerned about serving the people whose issues they were championing. So all of these things are connected. Even though I make a distinction between the three types, they're interconnected. And transformative leadership, how do you then take the adaptive leadership, the servant leadership, how is that transformative? My thing about transformative leadership is that you have to start with a vision of where you want to go. It's not just dealing with the present, with the here and now. It's how do you go from this situation to have an improvement in the lives of people broadly, not your own life. These people were not about themselves. They were about the community, the black community, the diaspora writ large. And so that, to me, is transformational leadership, which is based on respect, it's based on love, it's based on understanding, but also it's based on a sense of strategic vision. How do you go from where we are now to where we should be?
Well, you really then are saying that these women really had elements of all the modes of leadership.
Yes, yes, they did.
Okay. So just as you think about it, what were the highlights? What were some highlights for you? And if you want to even share one of those, you talked about sharing one of the readings, but before you do that, what are some highlights in doing this research and in getting these stories?
Well, the biggest highlight is the fact that these women were they didn't owe me anything. They didn't need to sit down with me and talk. But the fact that I was able to do that is really a testament to their generosity, but also to the fact that after decades, for a couple of them, it was like, okay, you really want to hear what I have to say about this? And I go, yes. And in the case of Leah Chase now, who I'm proud to say, I won't say my work started this, but she has now been lauded for her civil rights leadership. And the reason Leah Chase, she and her late husband, who owned Dookie Chase restaurant in New Orleans, the reason she's in the book is that people say, you have a chef in there? I go, yes, because she hosted meetings of interracial groups, from the students in SNCC to Martin Luther King to others. And that, remember, this is in the South, that was against the law. Their business could have been shut down at any moment, but she did it because she said, I knew what I had to do. My job was to feed them. And she says, who knew? And and reflecting upon it years later, she said, who knew you could change the world over a bowl of gumbo?
Right. Just share for our listening audience who Leah Chase is, because this is an example where you, because of your longtime work as a civil rights activist yourself and social justice activist, these names are very you're very comfortable, but
Yes.
the general public doesn't know. So,
well, I say that she's probably better known by the people of the James Beard Foundation, because she's called now the Queen of Creole Cuisine because of her the restaurant that she held, and even after Hurricane Katrina, rebuilt that restaurant in the same space, because she has always felt that what her restaurant really was a contribution to the community. And so that's really what she did. She is a local New Orleans person, and she just felt that her responsibility was to the people there. And so from her cooking, she talked about, at the beginning of the civil rights movement, as she defined it, that when people would come in and they would talk about all of these meetings and the demonstrations and things that they were planning, she was a little nervous, because she said, some of us older people, we wanted to go the more traditional way. And she said, and she says that she wishes that we would have supported these young people sooner than we did. But her biggest contribution is, as she says it, she says, I'm a chef, and my contribution is to feed the people. That restaurant, by the way, is still alive and well. She's still cooking in her restaurant at the age of 95. I interviewed her when she was about 90 years old.
that is a beautiful, very, very heart-stirring account. I didn't know that much about Judy Richardson. I was just really drawn to her because of the arts thing, the bookstore, and she ended up getting involved in. She's also got involved in film.
Judy was at Swarthmore College, and then she joined the Students for Democratic Society on campus, who was organizing against segregation. And she was very involved with trying to lift up the benefits and the working conditions for the workers at her school. And she left Swarthmore to join the staff, the holy grail at that time for young people, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And then among her duties there, she ran the 24-hour hotline. And that was, she said to me she was surprised that I focused on that. Because, if you're in the midst of doing the work, sometimes it takes an outsider to say, well, how influential that was. To me, that was a lifeline for SNCC activists, because what they did was they had to call in at the end of the day to say where they were, to make sure that people were alive. And Judy would then call the FBI office in Washington, D.C. to report on that. Later on, she co-founded the Drum and Spear bookstore in Washington, D.C., which at that time was the largest African-American bookstore in the country. After that, and she created a character, Afrocentric character called Biba Amina, and that was to introduce young people to black literature. And she really she did the first book signing at book publishing for Eloise Greenfield.
That's right,
and
yes.
Many of your listeners would know about Eloise Greenfield. And then later she became the associate producer for Eyes on the Prize series.
That's right. So what I think would be helpful for our audience, if you can just share like one thing about each of the writers, and then you wanted to read an excerpt, just one highlight.
I would love to do that. Let me go back to the ones we haven't mentioned.
Okay.
Dr. June Jackson Christmas, who was one of the first African Americans to graduate from Vassar College. She never worked in the South. So this is an example of my talking about people who were involved in the movement, but who did it in different ways. She and her late husband, Walter Christmas, later on they waged a personal fight against housing discrimination that changed New York City law, but during the Civil Rights Movement, they opened their New York City home to provide respite as well as counseling and fundraising support for civil rights workers from the South. They said Dr. Christmas is a psychiatrist. And in fact, I have a picture in the book from 1970 where she was at the American Psychiatric Association convention. And that picture was taken the day after students were killed at Jackson State College by our own United States forces. And people say to me about violence, against civilians, well, it can't happen here. And I say, it already did. And so Dr. June Jackson Christmas was just absolutely fantastic. She and her late husband, she then also served as mental health commissioner of the city of New York under 3 different mayors. She's alive and well. She's about 94 years old. Every time I show her picture, I tell people don't be jealous because she looks absolutely fantastic. And I always say that's the life of social justice activism. That's what it gets you.
Right. Do you know that
Eileen Hernandez was a student leader at Howard University during World War II, and then I have to remind people how Washington, D.C. is a southern city and was as segregated as the rest of the South was. Eileen Hernandez became the first African-American president of the National Organization for Women, which she left after they elected an all-white officer slate. She later co-founded the National Women's Political Caucus and Black Women Organized for Political Action. She served in later life on the board of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. And when I interviewed her in her office a few years ago, she was still taking the bus to the commission meetings. She was still as active. She became, between the EEOC and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the National Organization for Women, she also became a labor leader and activist. She's the only one of the women I interviewed who died before the book was published, and I regretted that so much.
Okay, I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to hear the excerpt. So if you can just give one sentence about each person who we haven't talked about, and then we'll close by reading having you read the excerpt.
Thank you. Diane Nash led the Nashville sit-in movement. She continued the Freedom Ride. And see the movie Selma. She's pictured in that. Kathleen Cleaver, I will quickly say, my shorthand for Kathleen Cleaver is she's the real Black Panther. She was the first woman to serve on the Central Committee of the Black Panther Party, one of the smartest people you will ever meet in life. Gay McDougall was the first African American to integrate Agnes Scott College outside of Atlanta, Georgia. She became a lawyer, among other things. She led the anti-apartheid movement, and there's a picture of her in the book, the famous picture of her with someone we all know, the great Nelson Mandela, where she accompanied him as he voted for the first time. So that is Gay McDougall. Gloria Richardson from Cambridge, Maryland, was considered the Lady General of the Civil Rights Movement because she was the only one of the people I interviewed who talked seriously about not believing in nonviolence. She believed in nonviolence as a tactic, but she was not passionately a believer of nonviolence, as was Diane Nash. And then I think you want me to read a little excerpt about Myrlie Evers.
Yes, and we are at Medgar Evers College.
Yes.
Love
Medgar Evers College. Okay. Shall I do it now?
Yes, please.
Okay, this is about Myrlie Evers, who I should say was a partner with her husband in every way. She really ran that office in Jackson, Mississippi. And so this is really a very brief excerpt. And so she's saying, this is toward the end of the interview, she's saying it was an exciting but frightening time because you stared at death every day and you walked and death walked along with you. But there was always hope, and there were always people who surrounded you to give you a sense of purpose. You try to prepare. You do a little role playing. I personally would put myself in a position mentally where I had just lost my husband. I knew it was coming. I recall a conversation with Medgar not too long before his assassination. I said to him, I can't live without you. I can't make it without you. And he looked at me and said, you're much stronger than you think you are. You will be okay. You must believe it. Today, when I visit my former home, I can still see the blood. We needed to get away from that place. Our oldest son reached a point where he refused to eat. He would not study. He would not talk. My daughter would go to bed with her dad's picture holding it every night. The youngest one, who was 3 at the time, would go to bed with this little rifle. I knew we could no longer live in that house. A woman who was lonely and afraid, but one who was determined to make it. Everything that I did was based on what I thought Medgar would have wanted, and the promises that I made to him the night before he was killed. My grandmother said to me, you run as far away from Mississippi as you can get without going into the ocean. California became home, and until today, it still is.
Wow. Very, very moving. Very, very moving. I mean,
she is a very gracious person, and she's very, very deep and passionate, and a little bit not what you would expect in someone we hold in such high, idyllic regard. She, like other people, she wants to be seen as a real person, flesh and blood, real life person who is living in the now.
Yes, yes. So we have to think about legacy, what you've done in chronicling the lives of these women is to ensure that we have a legacy. What do you say to young people about the legacy? Why is it important that we hear these stories?
It's important because it gives them strength and inspiration and hope. And it's interesting, I just met the screenwriter for the Black Panther, Joe Robert Cole, and I think of when they say, praise the ancestors, but they're also very forward-looking, because we are the people who must, it's not only legacy, we use their experiences and their wisdom to move ourselves forward. And I think that's what I want people to know. And also to know that there's leadership, there are leaders all around them. They need to look, they need to ask questions, and take from that lessons that they can then share with other people. That's how we have survived. We have survived chattel slavery in this country. That is absolutely, when we think about that, how amazing that is.
Oh, several hundred years, that's right. You know, part of that we touched on was that this book is dedicated to Derek Bell and to your mother. Do you want to just share with the audience how that impacted your telling of the stories of these women?
Yes, well, my mother lived in rural Arkansas and was unable to go to high school because the closest school for black children was 100 miles away in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so, of course, she became passionate about education. She taught me and my siblings to read at age 4. She amassed a library for us. She worked mostly as a maid in hotels and motels and for people who were relatively rich in comparison to us, and whose children threw away books or gave them away, and my mother would bring them home. So I had a great library as a child, and reading to me was a way of just, I always said the one sense I always wanted to have was the vision, so I could really continue to read. And I always wrote, but I never, until recently, really considered the importance, the true importance of writing for a larger audience. And so I notice you always say that the reading and writing, you make that connection between those. And I think that's right. And I think that what they do is that they provide us with a reservoir of knowledge. And that's really critical to our, not only our creativity and sheer joy, but it's critical to our survival. You know, we may be like, some of us may be like the people at the end of Fahrenheit 451, where we have to be the books. When we have people like now who deny history, and not black people, but other people who deny history and claim certain things didn't exist, who try to pretend that slavery was a choice or that the Holocaust did not exist.
Yes, amazing.
Some of us have to be there to tell the truth. We have to be the Gwendolyn Brooks of our generation. We have to be Shakespeare. We have to be Langston Hughes. We have to be Toni Morrison. And Ntozake Shange. We have to tell the story.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Dewart Bell, for giving us this wonderful narrative of the lives of African-American women in the civil rights movement, Lighting the Fires of Freedom. I love the title. And I want to encourage our listening audience to go out and purchase the book. If it's not in your bookstore, ask them to order it.
Thank you.
Now, of course, you can get it online. And thank you for your work. This has been, yes, you wanted to say something? Yes.
Yes, I wanted to thank you. I mean, you started so many things, been active in promoting black literature and black authors, and you have lit the fires of freedom. So I stand in awe, and I just want to thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Remember, the writer is always writing, the reader's always reading. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. I want to thank my engineer, Marvelous Marvin, and of course Fritz. And this is Dr. Brenda Green signing off.
And he wrote a poem about rivers.